when he says, if you'd never heard of evolution, you would never think of such a thing about the Genesis text. That's demonstrably wrong because the church fathers, Origen and Augustine, have never heard of biological evolution or Darwin, and yet they advocated a figurative reading of the text, much as I do. From the call of Abraham in chapter 12 on, you have straightforward historical narrative. But
Okay.
Genesis 1 to 11 is acknowledged by every New Testament commentator to be apart from the rest of Genesis, to be a special sort of narrative and a peculiar genre of literature.
You said new, but I assume you meant old, just for
Yeah,
clarification.
I didn't mean new.
So the church fathers and all Old Testament scholars today, all of them agree that Genesis 1 through 11 is its own separate thing, and they interpreted this figurative.
No, that's just patently false. Now, I'm not going to argue that every single church father was a young earth creationist, but you do have statements from several of them talking about how God made everything in 6 days, and those days correspond to 1,000-year periods. He's not saying that they are each 1,000 years. He's saying that there's going to be 6,000 years of history before Jesus returns for the 7,000th year, which would be like a millennium. And we're not there yet, meaning that the world would be less than 6,000 years old at the time they're writing those things. So several church fathers believe that. Augustine came right out and said that it hasn't been 6,000 years since Adam was created. So how can you say every single church father taught that? And it's certainly not true today that every single Old Testament scholar or commentator says that the Genesis 1 through 11 is written in a different genre than 12 onward. That's also patently false. Stephen Boyd's a Hebraist, and he says that he shows the same thing. Todd Beale's got a chapter in Terry Mortenson's book, Coming to Grips with Genesis, where he points out that chapter 12 begins with what's known, it's basically, and God said to Abram, so it's a viomer, it's continuing from what was going on before. So if this is a new thing, and it's finally just starting to be real history, why does it connect to the previous line? And why is Abram and Sarah and Lot, why are they mentioned in Genesis 11 if this is not real history? But then we also see them in chapter 12, and they're connected to the people before them, going back to Noah. You have the same sort of, if we can say like subheadings or headers in the book of Genesis. 10, it appears 11 times, twice in the Esau account. So like 10 different ones where it says, this is the book of the generations of so-and-so. Those are known as the Toledotes. You have 6 of those in Genesis 1 through 11 and 4 or 5 counting the double of Esau in the rest of the chapters. So obviously who's ever writing this, Moses, is showing you they're the same style. In fact, we know they're the same style. They're written as historical narrative. Now, there are a lot of scholars who have bought into the millions of years who argue that you need to come up with a different hermeneutic, a different way of interpreting Genesis 1 through 11, but the genre is exactly the same. And so there's no reason from the text itself to apply a different hermeneutic. Certainly the New Testament authors don't. Certainly Moses doesn't when he refers back to those chapters. So in Deuteronomy 32, when he talks about how, remember when God separated the nations and he divided them, he's talking about Babel. He's talking about that as a real event, and he's telling the people to ask their fathers, and they'll tell you when this happened. But Craig says, oh, this is just myth. And yet Moses is telling the people in Deuteronomy 32 to ask about that because it's a real event. And you see Jesus talking about these people and events as real people and events. Of course, he tries to address that in his book, and I think fails miserably.
Now let's address that. Okay, so in his book, he's trying to say, I'm trying to critique all the views. I'm trying to look at everything, and yet I read a document, a review, a rebuttal of his book that you wrote. Actually, I want to make that available to everybody if you're cool with that. I want to. In that rebuttal, you pointed out that he really doesn't deal with any of the biblical creationist claims. He actually ignores it almost as though it's beneath him to even talk about it. Can you address that?
Yeah, and I think you saw a little bit of that in the first 2 clips we saw when he was asked about young earth creation. You can tell he doesn't want to. You can tell he is irritated by it. The fact that he doesn't want young earth creationism to exist in the church. I've got news for him. He's going to be really disappointed throughout eternity when at least for the first 10, 15, 20,000 years that we're with the Lord, it's still a young earth, right? Now, at some point, it will become an old earth, like when we've been there for millions of years. But I think he can be frustrated for a while during that time. Actually, I don't think he will be. I think he'll be rejoicing like the rest of us, but probably going, why did I buy
Why did I say all
I should have
that?
just trusted what God's word says. Yeah, sorry. But here's what's interesting to me. If I were to write a paper, let's put it this way. Let's say I was supposed to critique this book, and I never cited this book in the entire thing. Do you think I would get a passing grade?
No, that's
No.
not academic.
If I just summarized 4 times out of 400 and over 400 pages and made 4 little statements summarizing something that he allegedly said, and immediately said this is a wild theory or this maverick view, and that's all I ever said about this book, would I get a passing grade?
I think ChatGPT could do better for you than that.
Do you realize that's what he did with young earth creationism? He never, as far as I could find, and when I looked through the bibliography and everything as well, he never quoted a young earth creationist. He did allude to 4 different writings from 3 different young earth creationists, and immediately after citing them, he says something like this maverick view or this wild theory or this radical theory, something like that. Never actually dealing with the text, never dealing with the way that we would present it, and whether from scholars. I'm not saying that every young earth creationist is a scholar, but there are scholars who are young earth creationists who have written on this topic. I held up this book before, Coming to Grips with Genesis. Dr. Terry Mortensen, who William Lane Craig knows personally. Okay, they've known each other for decades. He did this book years ago to show people that Genesis should be taken in a straightforward manner. Terry Mortensen, and by the way, it's not just Terry Mortensen, there are a bunch of scholars who contributed to this. And he did the same thing several years ago called Searching for Adam. That's a relevant topic, isn't it? Well, guess what book never shows up in here and is never addressed? None of the arguments are dealt with. He doesn't touch the arguments presented by young earth creationists. Therefore, I know there was a video a while back when this came out where Ken Ham said that he's acting as a pseudo-intellectual, and William Lane Craig took a lot of you could tell that really bothered him because he is an intellectual guy. He's a very smart guy, and that bothered him. But when he did it, he is behaving in a way that is like a pseudo-intellectual. He is doing something that a lot of people do, not just secularists. A lot of Christians are guilty of this. When they're trying to push their view and they don't have strong arguments for it, they will snowball you with all sorts of other things. And they're not showing you what the text says. They're not doing a careful look at the text. They're doing everything they can to avoid that. In fact, they're kind of obfuscating the truth. They're hiding the truth behind all of the stuff they're throwing out there. And so it's something for you to be aware of. There are a lot of Christians who argue that way too. And it's a lot of empty rhetoric. You got to learn to pick through all that and say, okay, but what does the Bible say? And he's not really telling us because he mocks it in Genesis 1 through 11.